What even is the engineer? Wait, this makes so much more sense. A new theory.
I recently published a video where I explored what I thought the engineer was.
If you want to watch that video first, there's a link on the screen and in the description. And while you're at it, why not subscribe? That way you won't miss any future videos in this series.
Anyway, plugs aside, my slightly jokey answer in that video was the baddie, because what we do in the game is pretty monstrous.
But my main conclusion was that I thought the engineer was some sort of AI in a robotic body.
However, one of the commenters on that video, Jackson Knock, suggested another theory.
And, if I'm totally honest, I think I actually prefer their theory. In fact, I liked it so much that it kind of broke my later video ideas.
So I'm doing this video instead, where I'm going to do an analysis of Jackson's theory.
As you can see, Jackson's theory is that the engineer is some kind of highly adaptable, shape-shifting biomass.
The bit that particularly intrigued me is what Jackson suggested later on, that they had perhaps eaten the engineer. When I read this, it instantly brought to mind the monster in The Thing.
In particular, I thought of the version from John Carpenter's remake. This thought is what broke my later videos, but I'm getting way ahead of myself.
Let's discuss Jackson's points and how they compare to my original conclusions.
Wielding a railgun. The engineer can wield a railgun. The point here, I think, is that the railgun could be pretty large and heavy, and maybe that it has a huge recoil. Basically, I guess the point is that it would be too much for a normal human to handle.
While this may or may not be true for the engineer's version, commercial, handheld railguns have been developed, and it is possible for a normal human to use them.
As such, the biomass explanation doesn't really have any advantages or disadvantages over the other possibilities that I've already discussed. A robot, future human, or alien could be strong enough to use it as well. 1v1 a medium biter. The engineer can 1v1 a medium biter in hand-to-hand combat, but is still equipped with a useless pistol. The hand-to-hand part is a good example of the engineer being super strong, but a biomass doesn't necessarily make more or less sense compared to the other options in my original analysis. However, I think the more important point here is the pistol. If you're from a species that's so strong, then why are you carrying such a wimpy pistol? Surely anyone from your species would barely feel it.
One explanation here is that the pistol isn't really intended for killing. Perhaps it's more about stunning someone or putting them off. After all, many police around the world use less lethal weapons like
tasers, water cannons, and beanbag rounds. This point therefore could align with any of the explanations we've explored. But if it's a non-lethal weapon, it then begs the question, why does the engineer even have it?
But I don't think this is what Jackson's really getting at. The pistol is very nicely explained by the idea that the biomass has taken over, or is otherwise impersonating, the original engineer.
The presence of such a weapon suggests that the original engineer was more squishy. This was a weapon that could kill an engineer proper, but it can't kill the biomass. And of course biters are tougher than normal humans, so it makes sense it does very little damage to them as well. This therefore makes it seem like a wimpy weapon, but in reality it is effective against normal engineers. It's just that we're not a normal engineer. Handheld nukes. The engineer can fire a nuke from a personal rocket launcher, the same nuke that's too heavy for a space rocket. The key point here is the size and weight of the nuke in question. During the Cold War, the US did actually develop a range of smaller nukes. They even had one that was fired from a small rocket launcher. It would maybe have been a bit unwieldy to shoulder launch, but it might have been possible. The same warhead type could actually be built to all sorts of different sizes. I mentioned in my How to Shatter a Planet video that the US developed nuclear demolition charges, and these are in the same family, so nukes of just about any size are possible.
However, that's not quite the point. The point is that the engineer's nuke is big and heavy.
The space rocket can carry 1 ton, but you can't put a nuke in it. So if it's that big, then a human, or anything with similar strength, couldn't fire it from a shoulder-mounted launcher.
While I agree with this basic point, it again doesn't really point to the biomass explanation as being more likely than the others.
I've already established that the engineer is stronger than a basic human, so this is just more evidence of that. By the way, the real explanation here is simply gameplay. Wooby doesn't want us trivialising the combat by nuking all the other aliens as soon as we see them. So, although the tooltip says it's too heavy, you can also think of other reasons why you couldn't put one of the engineer's nukes on a cargo rocket. For example, it could simply be unstable. The engineer's design may be so bad that the G-forces and buffeting would set it off. The engineer's personal weight. The engineer is almost too heavy for a space rocket. This point is also a weight one, and is more evidence that the engineer isn't a basic human. But, as with the others, I think robot, alien, or future big human could explain this just as well as a biomass.
However, the biomass idea does make me wonder about an intriguing additional point.
If we assume the rocket design is stolen from the original engineer's memory, then it's a little odd that it only holds a single engineer. If it is intended as a single engineer thing, why not make it powerful enough so it could also carry their inventory?
This is an especially weird design choice if you buy the whole pocket dimension thing that I mentioned in my engineer video. This species apparently thinks nothing of having a pocket dimension to carry all their stuff in, but doesn't consider that weight when designing their rockets.
Either way, wouldn't it make more sense if the rocket was able to carry either multiple engineers or an engineer plus their inventory? For reference, the NASA Space Shuttle was designed to be able to lift 29 metric tons into orbit. Although note that it was actually overspec'd, so the US military could have it deploy and collect large spy satellites. Now this gravity is similar to Earth's, so I have only one design that's only able to lift a single engineer.
Well, what if it isn't a single engineer design? What if this design is actually able to carry multiple engineers? But the biomass is so dense that, even though it's the same size, it's much heavier, and that means the rocket can only lift one biomass engineer without their inventory.
Personal equipment. The engineer can deploy a local field of 200 plus personal solar panels to recharge their armour. It's not visualised in game, but that's what I imagine it's doing. It sounds a bit like I'm dismissing all of these points, but they're kind of more evidence of things I've already talked about and proven that I don't think particularly align with the biomass concept on its own. So I'm only going to touch on this one quickly as well. The whole personal equipment thing is just odd on so many levels. But again, this points to increased strength. And increased strength is explained by all the candidate explanations. The other points get more into the meat of the biomass idea. Repair packs don't fix the engineer. The engineer can rapidly heal mid-combat by consuming fish and alien fruits from Gleba, but not the repair packs.
Now we're getting into some really intriguing possibilities that Jackson's biomass idea actually does a lot better job of explaining.
I did touch on the healing point in my video, but I was a bit hand-wavy with my explanations because it's not a great fit for any of my ideas. An inorganic engineer, such as a robot, doesn't really seem to match very well at all. Surely a repair pack would be the best way to heal a robot engineer. This rapid healing thing could work, however I don't know about you, but I've never heard of anyone instantly healing a broken leg by eating a fish. Alien physiology could be very different, so this maybe works.
But that wasn't my conclusion, was it? However, the specific idea of some sort of parasitic or body replacement alien, like the Thing, works really well.
For example, in the film, the Thing is shown to absorb biological material very rapidly, right down to a cellular level. That manifesting as some sort of Wolverine-style healing factor makes a lot of sense. Maybe the engineer is actually a Wolverine? It doesn't have any claws though, so maybe we're talking a Deadpool? Health increase. There's a Gleba research that increases the engineer's base health. I deliberately ignored this in my video, partly as I wanted to focus more on the vanilla game, but it also felt a little like restating some of the same points. Increasing the health bar could represent several things, like an increased toughness or becoming bigger and stronger. So it sort of maybe works for a robot, stronger components maybe, but not really, especially as it's an agricultural science. That suggests some sort of biological alignment, and again, my conclusion was that the engineer wasn't biological. However, it does work well for this biomass alien. Perhaps it's learning how to increase its durability so that it can absorb more punishment. Or perhaps it's replacing its flesh with a tougher version. After all, Jackson's point is that it's a very adaptable creature. Researching how to become tougher does therefore make a lot of sense.
Even though, as a tech in the game, it's a weird outlier that is actually a bit pointless.
Poison. The engineer is not immune to poison damage.
This is a big flaw in my AI robot theory. A robot being affected by poison makes little sense.
You could maybe be very generous and say the poison is actually more like a toxic effect, but that still doesn't really work. The biters already use acid, so we know it must be a different effect to that. I guess it could be a sort of weaker version of biter acid, but then why would it affect the biters, since they're clearly immune to their own spit attack? The only explanation of the engineer that really stacks up here is a biological one, and so a future human, alien, or biomass is a far better answer than my robot one.
Which is why I ignored it.
Labs, but not the doggo. Labs can transfer data to the engineer even when they're on another planet.
This is a really interesting point that got me thinking.
To me, it begs the wider question of how we're able to communicate with any of our machines remotely. In the original game, we could only adjust machines within a short distance, so this suggested some sort of short-range wireless communication. Think Bluetooth. That could align with any type of engineer, but we were always able to set research remotely, no matter how far away we were.
I'll pick this point back up in a moment when we get to Jackson's full theory.
Biolabs are easier. The engineer finds biolabs easier to use than normal labs, even for research that has nothing to do with biology. I'm guessing the point about the biolabs being better at organic techs is that it would make much more thematic sense if biolabs were better at agricultural technology. But I think that easier to use is a bit of a euphemism. There's a living biter nest in there that the biomass engineer could assimilate with, so it makes a whole lot of sense that the biolabs will be more productive than ordinary labs. The Biomass Theory.
As I hope you can tell, I really do like this theory. It explains all the stuff I was talking about last time, but also covers a whole lot more of Factorio's weirdness.
Jackson then goes on to describe some features of the biomass, so let's take a look at those as well. Adaptability. It can adapt its body to any temperature or pressure.
This absolutely makes sense. It's a shapeshifter that can toughen itself up for the high pressure and extremes of temperature on the other planets.
I could even see it changing its respiratory system to 1. Extract more oxygen from the air, Fulgora. 2. Filter out spores, Clever. And 3. Remove pollutants, Volcanus. Sustenance. It can probably sustain itself by eating a wide variety of non-organic materials, though organic food has additional benefits. I confess this one is a little bit of a stretch, but I allowed myself some similar flexibility in my first video.
In that video, I guessed that the biological stuff was turned into bioplastics to repair the robot's body, and it didn't really need food.
Using non-organic materials for food and healing is kinda similar. It could be that the biomass engineer is able to break down the inorganic stuff and incorporate it into its body. Maybe it becomes an armoured skin or something like that.
But, to be frank, using non-organic materials for eating or healing isn't actually part of the game, so it's sort of irrelevant.
It could simply be that the engineer eats, it's just not something we see. And, as I said in my first video about the engineer, Factorio isn't really a survival game. Cloning. It can make clones, assign them to labs, and communicate remotely with them. I touched on this already, but to me this makes a lot of sense.
A concept where the biomass creates clones of itself, which it then has a psychic link to, and it's those clones that operate each individual lab, is kinda genius.
With Space Age, we also gain the ability to communicate with everything remotely. And this really got me thinking, what if that's how all the machines work? What if there's some sort of clone or clade mind attached to and operating every machine in Factorio?
This would then explain how a generic assembly machine is able to make just about anything that doesn't involve processing oil. It's being operated by something with intelligence.
I think this also extends to biochambers. Although we know that the engineer makes them by imprisoning a small pentapod, they may be controlled by a part of the engineer. That's why the pentapod doesn't escape, and why they even do the horrible chemical processing that they've been tasked with. I think this could even explain upgraded machines. The biomass gets better at running them. so it's able to work faster while also coping with more complex internal workings. It can even explain things like bots and logistics. A bit of the biomass engineer is attached to them and controls them, but it's only a small bit, so it has a limited set of very specific functions.
That's why bots fly in straight lines and don't react to being damaged, because they don't have enough smarts to do anything else.
What about the tank remote control?
It's a bit of the engineer you patch into.
But then why is there a fish in the Spidertron?
Well, Spidertrons are harder to control. They've got 8 legs rather than 2 tracks. So the engineer needs an assistant to help them. I'm sure it's entirely voluntary.
Perhaps guns and artillery know how to target things because there's a part of the biomass engineer controlling them.
Perhaps that's what green, red and blue circuits are about. Yes, they're electronic circuits, but they include more and more complex parts of the biomass engineer, enabling more and more complex automated behaviour. Even burner tech makes more sense.
Sure, you're burning fuel, but that fuel is feeding biological components that are a part of the machine. While giving things electricity was always easy to hand-wave away, burner tech has never made a lot of sense. Burning something doesn't create energy that's usable as work without some kind of engine, and we don't include engines when building burner tech machines. If the energy is instead consumed by some sort of biological innards, then, although it's still a bit unclear, this sounds a lot more plausible to me.
Heck, you could even imagine it's how belts get power.
There's a little bit of the biomass engineer on them, and that's grabbing nutrients from the ground or the air, or perhaps absorbing sunlight, and that's what powers it.
I even really like this for explaining the whole "the factory must grow" thing.
It's basically that the engineer is the factory, and the factory is the engineer. But I also had another idea about this concept.
What if the factory was the original engineer's dream project?
What if the biomass took over the engineer while he was busy daydreaming about building some huge factory? Perhaps that dream then got absorbed into the biomass engineer's consciousness. Maybe building a factory became some sort of deep down desire that the biomass engineer had, but it didn't really know why. When it crashes, it's suddenly presented with the opportunity to realise that dream.
It became this driving need that the biomass engineer has to just build and build and build without any real purpose or even understanding why.
Death and rebirth. Regrowing or reassigning a new main body after losing a previous one is trivial for it. I think this is a really good explanation as it explains the whole respawning thing really well. Perhaps there's a bit of the biomass engineer that grows up and becomes sentient. Or perhaps the biomass engineer has just stored a bunch of clones or malleable biomass in the ship wreckage, and so each time it's a new clone or copy emerging from the old ship.
I guess if you get rid of the ship, then you can just think of the spare biomass as a sort of lump on the ground.
I've already discussed that, based on this theory, I think that perhaps all parts of the biomass engineer are semi-sentient, a bit like the Thing. The brief pause when respawning could therefore perhaps be the time it takes for this clone to wake up, or perhaps it transfers its main consciousness to the clone. Another possibility is it's more like a hive mind, so all parts of it are conscious at all times. That could help to explain the high level of intelligence as well. However, it doesn't quite explain why the biomass is wearing the same clothes and has the exact same pistol and small amount of ammo each time, but more on that in a moment. Having the engineer for lunch. It may have eaten the original human engineer.
As I said at the top, this was where my brain went, wait, just like the Thing. This makes so much sense.
Achievement pictures aside, the engineer doesn't ever come out of its clothes. It's always wearing this complete protective suit that hides all of its flesh. And this could make some sense behaviourally if it's trying to hide among a crew. If you're always completely hidden away, then it's going to be easier not to get spotted as an imposter. So maybe it picked the engineer specifically for that reason.
As I already noted, why it then wears the exact same clothes each time it respawns is a little puzzling. For one thing, if it's on Nalvis completely on its own, then why does it bother hiding at all? Why not just change to a more useful form?
Well, this could be explained by its instincts. It's a species that needs to hide among other life forms, so it would hardly be a good idea to change every time it thinks it's alone. It doesn't definitely know for a fact that there are no other engineers on the planet, or if they might be trying to rescue it at some point. So it's better to stay looking like an engineer. It may also not really have an original form, but I'll talk more about that later when I revisit the form factor discussion. It could also simply be that the engineer form is actually the best it has in its memory for handling the situation. I think that's a bit of a stretch though. Again, how would it have clothes, a pistol and ammo on respawn? Well, one possibility is that these are things it forms or grows itself. The Marvel character Mystique perhaps forms a good model here. She is a shapeshifter, but part of this is actually forming the clothes as well. Perhaps the clothes we see the engineer wearing are just its skin.
I don't really like this theory. It doesn't even really make sense when Mystique does it, and I think the pistol and ammo don't track with this, but more on that later.
Fleeing pursuit. It has fled to a star system full of asteroids in order to escape pursuit. I mean, this isn't far off what happens at the start of the thing, so I think this is a good explanation. The real engineers found it out and then tried to kill it, but it grabs a ship and escapes. Knowing how dangerous it is, perhaps it's a species known throughout the galaxy, they keep pursuing it. It sees the Nauvis system full of asteroids and flees there hoping to put them off.
This is actually what broke my later video idea, so I'll leave it there and you can look forward to my revised Why Did the Engineer Crash video.
The pursuers assume it's dead. Upon crash landing on Nauvis, it is presumed dead by its pursuers. This does explain why these pursuers would leave. The crash looks pretty catastrophic. Perhaps far more than the real engineer species could have survived, so they assume it died in the crash. Perhaps they stick around for a bit just to make sure, but then decide it must have died, and that's when we emerge and the game starts.
It does beg the question of why the engineer crashed. The most obvious explanation is that it could have been an accident.
The biomass engineer was flying close to the asteroids, using them to try to put off its pursuers, but it wasn't working, and the biomass engineer got unlucky or took too big of a risk and hit one.
Another possibility is it did it deliberately.
It was perhaps fairly certain that it would survive. As per the thing, maybe even a small part of it can take over a new host and continue.
I do have some other theories. Of course I do. But I'll pick those up in a later video that I mentioned. Subscribe for that nonsense. And if you become a channel member, you can get early access.
Technologies. It doesn't take too long for it to replicate the technologies that humans had in their memories. Over time, it begins to improve upon them, which takes much more effort and resources. Hey, why not? This is basically what the thing did. It absorbed its victims' memories so that it would know how to blend in by mimicking their behaviour. It doesn't seem that much of a stretch for it to absorb all the engineer's knowledge of technology and go about recreating it. I think my extension of the idea that all of the machines have a bit of the biomass engineer in them also works quite well here.
I said in my last video that maybe it's learning how to make the technology from the local materials, but this explanation always felt a bit lacking to me.
If we extend it to be more about how it also learns how to automate production using its subparts in the machines, then I think it works even better. As I said in my last video, it's not that it doesn't know how to make something like a bulk inserter. It knows that such a thing is possible, so it's not true research in that sense.
Instead, it's about learning how to make a bulk inserter and how to do it with the local resources.
But it's also about training the various bits of itself on how to automate that production. A good analogy might be machine learning, where you need to train the model so it can do stuff like identify dogs in a picture. Dogs and pictures are things that don't need researching, but getting this independent mind to understand how to identify a dog requires research. As I said before, we can even imagine that for some things, like assemblers, the biomass engineer then improves them. They make better, faster versions of the machines that are more capable. But this takes more time and resources, which means more research.
I think this concept works particularly well for the infinite technologies.
Initially, the biomass engineer is researching how to make things like guns and ammo, and, in particular, how to get its subparts to make them in assembly machines. Then, it researches better versions of them with more complex recipes. Eventually, the biomass engineer reaches the end of what the engineer's culture had done, but it knows more. It, or part of it anyway, has been around the galaxy, picking up learnings from all sorts of different alien species. So it starts to apply that extra knowledge to these technologies, making the weapons more lethal and the mining more productive. Because it knows so much, those possible upgrades are effectively infinite. Except they get more and more complex to apply, and that's why the infinite techs get more and more expensive. In this scenario, us not seeing exactly what it has actually done, other than a simple numerical buff, is just a gameplay thing.
One of the side things I like about this theory is that it might actually explain the science packs. It's always been a bit weird to me that you take a bunch of physical stuff, some of it quite large and unwieldy, and do something to it that results in a small beaker full of liquid.
Let's go back to the part of the theory about the engineer gaining nutrients from inorganic material. What if we tweak that so it doesn't so much gain nutrients as it can dissolve them into a sort of sludge that can go in a beaker? Perhaps it's also able to distill the key elements of this stuff into a sort of information goop. So the beakers are sort of a bioorganic memory liquid. In the labs, the biomass engineer's clones could therefore be consuming these liquids and analysing them. They would learn the properties of the materials and therefore how to make more and more complex things. It's a better theory.
So yeah, I think I prefer this theory to my own. But it also creates a new question. If what we play is the biomass engineer, or perhaps a capital T thing, then what was the original engineer? What type of beings are they?
I think here I come down much more favourably on the side of them being either human or alien. While an inorganic being could work, it just doesn't feel right somehow. Maybe this is me sticking far too close to the movie, but it just feels like a biomass would take over something organic, not something inorganic. Revisiting my old analysis.
With this new theory, we see that the real engineers are different to the engineer that we play. That means that we have less weirdness to explain away. I've therefore dusted off my old spreadsheet and added a few new categories.
Size and strength. The original engineers could be bigger and stronger than us, but the biomass engineer enhances both traits, so it doesn't really matter as much. The form factor explanation I gave in my original video still works. As I mentioned previously, it does beg the question of why the biomass engineer sticks with it, but if it's building things that are designed to work with a bipedal life form, then it makes sense to stick with that shape to make things easier. And, as I noted already, it's also likely an instinct thing. It sticks with the shape that blends in, and it keeps this form just in case. One thing I do think we need to address for the biomass engineer is why it doesn't switch to one of the local life forms, like the biters or pentapods. After all, the engineer has to expend quite a lot of time and effort killing them when it could just become one of them, so why not switch? I think part of this is obvious. The local life forms are not intelligent, and they don't have hands. As I touched on in my Fulgora video, they're not technologically advanced. If this biomass engineer wants to spread itself across the galaxy, then it needs to infiltrate species that are capable of interstellar flight, and sticking biters and pentapods on space platforms isn't really an answer to this. Also, I think we can look at the movie for inspiration here as well. I guess spoilers if you've not seen it, but at the beginning, the thing enters the American camp as a husky dog. This shows that it can adopt any organic form, not just humans, but it also shows that some animals can detect it. When the husky thing is put in the kennels, the dogs all growl and bark at it because they can, presumably, sense something is wrong. While this is a bit of a cliche, we can maybe assume something similar for the other life forms in the Nauvis system. Perhaps if it tries to infiltrate them, then they can tell the difference and it gets attacked anyway, and that's assuming it even wants to try. Robustness also works. The biomass is just tougher, or perhaps toughness is something that it can enhance compared to the basic engineer. Respawning also works, as we've discussed. This could mean that the biomass is functionally immortal, especially if it can clone itself. It's not teleporting or building a new version of itself. Instead, it's transferring its consciousness to a new body, or promoting one of its clones to be the lead. This is what I think is going on with the clothes and pistol. The ship it crashed in looks like a short-range vessel or an escape pod. I'm actually going to go into this in the video about why the engineer crashed. So it makes some sense that this craft could have a bunch of spare suits and some guns on board. The ability to heal super fast is also explained a bit better. The biomass engineer is all about absorbing flesh and reshaping it. I still think it's a little fantastical that it happened so quickly, but I think we can put that down to game mechanics. Sustenance still remains a puzzle, but this always felt more like a gameplay reasons thing than anything else. Intelligence, knowledge and use of weapons. As Jackson suggests, it absorbs these from the engineer. It can also apply other things it's learned from the species it's absorbed from across the galaxy. Handcrafting is an intriguing question. In my original video, I concluded that if it was a robot-like being, then it could have some sort of internal chamber, think mini-assembler, that makes these things while it does other stuff. This actually carries over quite well for the biomass engineer. If it's some sort of weird biomass that can make extra limbs, then it could be these that are doing the manufacturing. This does sort of contradict the idea of it keeping itself hidden instinctively, but that could be a relative thing. That is, the need to build the factory is worth taking the risk for. Something I also talked about in the last video was the idea of the engineer having a pocket dimension that explained where they put all their inventory. Of course, this could still be a thing. It could be an ability or technology that the original engineer had and the biomass engineer simply absorbs it. Or it could be an innate ability that the biomass has. Perhaps it can tuck away spare biomass in a secret pocket dimension that it can use to make clones or to take over other beings. It then simply repurposes this pocket dimension. Or perhaps it just extends a part of its body that it then uses as a giant pocket. A giant, fleshy, possibly slightly moist pocket. Ooh.
Now, let's look at those additional categories.
Poison damage. This aligns well with all of the biological explanations. Human, advanced human, alien, and, of course, the biomass. Our inorganic options of a robot or AI are contradictory to this, and a cyborg explanation would likely depend on how it's built. Remote control. This one really depends on how you explain it generally. If it's some sort of radio remote control, a robot or AI could communicate remotely like this, and a human or alien could simply have something on their suits that gives them a similar ability. Of course, the biomass engineer could do the same, but this works particularly well, in my opinion, with the clones concept. The biomass engineer attaches small parts of itself, probably brain matter, to every machine, and that allows it to communicate psychically. This clone idea does also explain the inconsistency with not being able to send signal network information between planets while still being able to interact with everything. The biomass engineer doesn't know how to send these signals, but it can still psychically communicate with other bits of itself. One is a gap in the original engineer's knowledge, and the other is just an innate ability of the biomass engineer. Conclusion.
In conclusion then, I think that Jackson's is my preferred theory, and, as a bonus, the monster part works even better now.
We're playing a biomass that's taken over or replaced the original engineer. We've crashed on this planet and we start building a factory so that we can get away and spread to other parts of the galaxy. Why we get obsessed with a number goes up factory is something I'd like to speculate on in a future video.
Instead, I'll leave you with one last thought. If the biomass engineer has attached parts of itself to all of the machines, then why do we keep getting run down by our own trains?
Well, I hope you enjoyed that reanalysis of what I think the engineer is. If you've got your own unique theories, then I might be interested in doing another video exploring some of the ideas. Drop them in the comments below. And in the meantime, if you want to know what I think happened to the Volgorans, check out this video. Poisson.